Oh, hello. This video was supposed to be up on Winter's SEO's channel, but due to copyright claims on the music, unfortunately it wasn't able to stay there for long, so I've moved it across to my channel. It's still a really good video, and it entirely focuses on the new Rogal Dorn battle tank, which I really like. Anyway, for those of you who hadn't seen this video yet, I hope you enjoy, and for those of you who have seen this video, that's why it's now here. Thanks for watching, let's crack on. So as I said, it's the new Rogal Dorn. Let's see what's in the box. Ah, sprues and paper. Yeah, everything does appear to be in order. Definitely tank looking, so there's some points. But the best part, never to be overlooked, is of course the stowage. I absolutely love stowage. We'll come back to that in a bit. Here's a few cool things I noticed. Some of the tracks are pre-bent for easy application, and this bit looks like the top of a Sherman. So, cool. Let's get building. So here we are at the end of the process before we get on to the real fun stuff, adding stowage. So anyone who knows me knows that I love adding loads of crap to my tanks. It can go from a lot of stowage to all the stowage. Why not? I love to treat every tank as a little diorama, and it's an amazing way to inject some personality into your models. So let's get cracking with this Rogal Dorn. I started off by adding all the stowage that comes in the kit, which is helpfully labelled out, and they give you a rough idea of where to put it. Overall, I had a really good time building this kit. Everything was simple, it went together smoothly, and there were no huge giant seams like there are on some other tanks. Looking at you, Repulsor. I also think this is probably one of the most realistic looking Imperial Guard tanks. The Leman Russ is all hard edges and slabbed sides, and the Baneblade is massive. And also equipped with massive slabbed front armour, which means if it gets hit by anything, it's going straight through. This, at least from the front, not the sides, let's be honest, has some chance of deflecting some incoming fire. As soon as I'd exhausted the options that come in the kit for stowage, I had to dig into my bits box and grab some other pieces I had lying around. All the resin bits you see here are available from March of War, who is an excellent friend of both my channel and Winter's channel. You can find his site, if Winters remembers, in the description below. There's never really a plan in place when it comes to adding stowage. I just add what looks cool where there's space to add it. So little sandbags all over the place, which of course they would have, bed rolls hanging off the side of the tank, and a little lasgun to the back of the gunner here. If it makes sense to, there's usually a little bit of a story attached. So the gunner's got extra cans of ammunition, he's got his little backpack next to him, and he's resting the gun on top of a big box, which helpfully is also providing a bit of cover for him. It's also not a problem to move things around if you're not happy where things are. I had a little jerry can here and I wasn't sure about it, so I moved it to the other side of the tank and added yet another big antenna, because the one it comes with, little piddly. That should do us for the stowage and building, at least for today. Checking the size comparison, it's much bigger than a Leman Russ, but still tiny compared to the massive super heavies. Honestly, it's a really cool heavy battle tank, filling that slot that previously was only held by Forge World models. Now, let's get on with some painting. I sprayed this guy black off camera with a rattle can, and now we're going to use the airbrush and my trusty Panzer Grey. I applied this healthily all over the main armour panels, but generally, as the tank got lower, I left it alone because the black's going to give us some natural shadows. The next step was to mix our Panzer Grey with some AK Silver Grey and make a highlight layer. I was having a bad airbrush day and it was very speckly, but it's fine. We're going to do so much battle damage to this guy that we're never going to notice it again. Speaking of the airbrush, you don't actually need to use one for this process. You can use a large soft brush if you want to give a natural highlight effect. Now we're on to the longest part of the process, which is base coating everything, starting with our metallics. I want to get all of my primary colours down before I add any kind of battle damage and weathering. You can treat this a little bit like you're making a real tank on a production line. What colours are going to go down first? Well, of course it's going to be the paint. Any battle damage or weathering can only come after the paint because these guys come off the production line brand new and unscarred. Next step was to add all the blacks using an absolute staple of my collection, Black Legion contrast paint. If you don't have this, pick this up. It's a one coat black and it is incredible. The next step is Zandri dust. We're going to use this to base coat all the handles of our tools, the sandbags and ropes. After this, we're switching to yet another classic paint, Rhinox hide. I'm using this for all of the straps and any areas I want to remain dark leather, like his boots. You'll notice I don't base coat everything in Rhinox hide. There are some areas I want to base coat with Mournfang Brown, for example. Variety is the spice of life, after all. Speaking of variety, we move into our first of our trifecta of spot colours, Field Blue, which is roughly equivalent to Thunderhawk Blue from Citadel. I'm using this on a few of the bed rolls and a few of the sheets lying about on top of the tank, and also this little bottle here. Military colours are generally quite drab, so that's why we're using this very desaturated blue. Up next, speaking of drab, is an olive drab, specifically Castellan Green from Citadel. I'm doing this on another couple of the bed rolls and all of the jerry cans. This is a classic military colour, so don't leave home without it if you're painting any Imperial Guard. The third of our spot colours is Corn Red, which is a nice deep dark red. I'm using this for all the lenses, a few of the extra tins and cans lying around, and the little box in front of the gunner. I'm also using it for the fuel barrels on the back and the squadron markings on the front of the tank here. You can use masking if you want, but generally I like to do freehand. If I get it right, it's quicker. If I get it wrong, it's slower, so I better get it right. I block in this entire front area in red and then come back later with a stripe of white straight through the middle. I then use some contrast wildwood to cover over the Zandri dust box that I painted previously. Wildwood is excellent. Very close to being done with our base coating now, and then we can move on to the fun stuff. The final thing I base coated here was this cool little cup. No tank is complete without a brew kit. Okay, our base coats are done. We can now go into the fun part. Here's a tip on how to chip. Take a sponge, put it between some tweezers, and then grab a butterfly clip. Then add that butterfly clip to the tweezers, and bam. Easy peasy. Your index finger and thumb will thank you. Starting with our trusty friend Rhinox hide, we're adding some to the sponge and then dabbing it into a tissue to remove most of the excess. Then, following the edges and sharp details of the tank, we're going to dab this everywhere we can. Don't worry about making mistakes here, and let the sponge do its thing. The more random the pattern, the better. I'm applying this all over the armour and any hard surfaces, like these oil barrels at the back and a few of the little tins and crates hanging around. If you make a couple of mistakes, that's fine. We're going to come back and add tons of mud in a bit anyway. Then I'm doing the exact same thing with Wild Rider Red here for all my red crates and boxes, and I'm going to do the exact same with Nurgling Green for my green areas. You can look at this as you essentially highlighting your tank whilst adding a ton of detail and character really quickly. My only advice for this bit is do try to be careful not to get any of the highlight colours like the reds and greens onto your main tank. It's not the end of the world if you do. You can cover it up with Rhinox hide or the next stage that we're going to come on to, but it's just easier for you if you don't do it. I also chipped with some Corn Red to blend this white stripe into the rest of the tank, to make it look like it's a third layer of paint that's been chipped and scratched. In hindsight, I probably should have done the exact same to the red paint with Panzer Grey, but at this point in time, I didn't think about it. It's never too late to have new ideas. The next step of chipping all over the main armour is to take some Dawnstone and do exactly what we did with the Rhinox hide. This is our highlight layer, and it helps the chips have some real depth, and it also can make it look like you've spent ages on this when we all know this probably took about 20 minutes. If you're doing a lot of chipping, my advice to you is this: put something on in the background, listen to a podcast, an audiobook, anything. It can get a little bit monotonous, but it is so satisfying when it does come together. Okay, that's our first round of batter damage done. Now we can go in and do some highlights, some shading, and tie the model together before we add all our big weathering effects. At this point, there's honestly not very much rhyme or reason as to why I'm doing each stage at a certain time. I'm just bouncing back and forth across the model as things catch my eye, adding layers here and there, doing different colours at different times. It's quite a satisfying process seeing the tank slowly come together like this. It's also worth noting that at this point I'm generally only highlighting the soft surfaces like the tarps and blankets. This is because all the hard surfaces have already been done by our chipping. Of course, I also had to add a little blue rim to our enamel cup here. It's just not right if it doesn't have a little blue rim. When it came to highlighting all the leather parts, generally for each bag I had a slightly different process. For those that I'd base coated in Rhinox hide, I highlighted up with a big layer of Mournfang Brown. For those that I'd base coated in Mournfang Brown, I highlighted up with a mix of that Mournfang Brown and Steel Legion Drab. This way, much like when we did all the hard surfaces, the jerry cans and the bottles, etc., things that are made of the same material don't all look the same, and it adds a ton of colour to our tank. For the blankets, after my layer, I added a final edge highlight of the brightest colour I could find in that family. In this case, this was Fenrisian Grey. For our sandbags, I started off with a wash of Agrax Earthshade. Give this a real good shake before you start, otherwise you'll end up with a slightly glossy finish. While I waited for that shade to dry, I highlighted our little gunner's face. Jumping back to the leather details, I did the final highlights with Baylor Brown. This is an excellent colour to add little scratches and nicks to, and if you add scratches and nicks to leather, it just starts to look even more realistic. I also use this colour to paint the box on the side of the tank, adding a bit of wood grain here and there. This step is entirely optional as wildwood is such a good colour to begin with. Actually, believe it or not, everything about this is optional. You don't have to glue the tank, you don't have to paint the tank, you don't have to watch this video. Please keep watching the video. Now the shade's dry on our sandbags, we can go back and add some texture. If you look at sandbags in real life, they're generally made of a very thick, rough cloth. So we're going in with Screaming Skull here in a crosshatch effect. What that is thin lines in one diagonal direction, and then thin lines in the opposite diagonal direction. Don't worry if you make any mistakes, it's rough broken cloth, it's fine. After I'd finished adding texture to all our sandbags, I made them look a little bit more aged by adding a very thin wash of Seraphim Sepia. Honestly, adding a glaze or wash of Seraphim Sepia to anything is always really satisfying, especially if you do it to parchment. I also took this time to start the muzzle burn on my melters and the main cannon. Once that's dry, we'll come back. I took this time, while everything else was drying, to highlight the trousers and arms of my little gunner. As I mentioned, I'm always trying to paint something. I'm jumping back and forth across the tank, so whilst something's drying, I'm doing something productive. Next up, here's a hack if you liked the old Nuln oil, but aren't too fond of the new one. Get a pot of Basilicanum Grey contrast paint, thin it down ever so slightly. I literally just put mine on a wet palette and then wash everywhere you would with Nuln oil. It looks very similar to the old style and covers a lot better than the new style. Also for this tank where we're trying to make it look aged and dirty, this is the perfect wash. Off camera, because I forgot to film it, I base coated the Searchlight in Eandan yellow. I carried on adding to the muzzle burn on my melter guns by adding Agrax Earthshade towards the end of the barrel, leaving some of that Seraphim Sepia showing. I also did this to the rear exhaust because these are going to get a very similar level of heat and soot and dust, and generally just be grimy. Alright, now we can get onto the really fun stuff, adding all that horrible weathering. Of course, if you want to leave it here, you can. I'm starting with enamel paints, aka streaking grime. I'm making little runnels all over the armour so it looks like some kind of oil has been dripping down the side of the tank. I'm being fairly liberal with this because over time, if a tank's operating in rain, it will end up with tons of runnels and rivulets all over the place. Now, as I mentioned previously, this is an enamel paint, so it does work slightly differently to an acrylic paint. Firstly, you can't clean it with water, you have to use mineral spirits. But you can then, after it's dry, reactivate the paint with mineral spirits to have some really cool blends. Also, for enamel paints, the surface tension is generally lower than acrylic, so it runs into recesses really nicely. Up next, I've got Panzer Grey, which is the exact same streaking grime as I've just used, just in a darker colour designed for the base coat that I've used on this tank. I'm adding this enamel paint to similar places where I added the original streaking grime. This further darkens down those areas. I'm also adding it in a few bespoke places just to add a bit of differentiation across the armour panels. Going back to those melters, I added some more muzzle burn by adding Druchii Violet. Next up on the weathering scheme is crusted rust deposits, also from AK. The important thing here is how much rust is too much. Never add it to anywhere that's going to be grinding against something, so where wheels are touching, that's not the place to go. On main weapons, probably not also the place to go because they're constantly in use and constantly being cleaned. I'm adding this to the grills on the back, which routinely did get rusty on Second World War era tanks, and also on the tracks on the side of the hull. The next layer of rust was actually a thinned down acrylic paint, Mournfang Brown. If you don't have or want to use enamel paints, you can use thinned down acrylics for a similar effect. Now onto some mud. I'm taking an old crusty brush and some Vallejo thick mud and applying that all over the tracks. I highly recommend picking up Vallejo or AK's mud effects because they are amazing value for money. They're about £10 a pot and they cover far more than those little £4 GW ones. When applying mud to a tank, make sure you apply more at the back of the tracks. This is because the motion of the tracks will be flinging mud up towards the back of the tank. I'm actually going to be doing 2 layers of different muds. This is my first layer, the dry mud, the older mud that's been on the tank for quite some time. Again, as mentioned, I'm focusing more towards the back, but there will be some on the front as the tank has splashed through muddy puddles in the past, or even had shells explode throwing mud onto them. I'm also adding a little bit below the gunner to show where he would have stepped up onto the tank, because he hasn't got clean boots. That's our dry mud done, now we're moving on to the dark mud. Luckily, the dry mud has shown us exactly where we want this dark mud to go. We leave a little bit of the dry mud showing below, but be quite liberal with this step, add as much or as little as you like. I always find this step to be really satisfying. I've put all the hard work into base coating, highlighting, adding the chips, and this stage is just, playing with paste. It's great. Okay, with our mud effects done, we are very nearly done with this tank. I'm using our penultimate enamel paint, Earth Effects. I didn't want to apply this before I added all the paste because you never quite know where it's going to go or how it's going to look, and we could have ended up with a weird transition between the two. Now the mud's on though, I can apply this without any fear. I'm once again focusing it more towards the back and towards the lower skirts where mud will have splashed up. Another method for doing this is using a toothbrush and flicking it on with a toothpick. I went for a more measured approach here. Again, enamels have low surface tension, so I didn't want them to just flood all over the place. While that enamel dried, I added some more rust to the wheels. Now that I know where the mud is, I can add this without worrying about covering it up. Our final enamel paint is dust effects. I'm going to be applying this very carefully over certain areas of the tank. Too much and will completely wash out the tank and it will look like it's in a different environment to where I want it to be. Now this dust is excellent for desert vehicles, but in this situation I'm viewing it more as that very fine clay-like powder you get when mud has dried. What really helps tie it all together is that dry layer of mud we added before the wet layer. This is essentially the remnants of that dry layer. I'm allowing it to run into the folds of fabrics all over the box. Where crew will be walking around. Back to the earth effects, they've now dried, so I added a little bit of mineral spirits to the end of my brush and reactivated them on the tank. This allowed me to blend it quite nicely into those mud effects I'd used earlier. I did this all over the tank to make the transition smoother, and with that, that'll be our tank complete. I really hope you enjoyed this one. You can find me over on Salt and Plays if you'd like to see more, and I'd like to thank Winters once again for letting me put this on his channel. This tank is excellent. Anyway, I've been Sam, and hopefully I'll see you next time.